Slaves. Hello, slaves. Good afternoon, slaves. Hey, wait. Are you slaves? Did you escape? Did someone free you? Were you redeemed? Or are you slaves? We are told many times to remember that we were slaves. We're also told many times to remember that we have been rescued and freed from being slaves. And we are specifically on the first day of Unleavened Bread told to remember that we were slaves and that we have been rescued from being slaves. So what is it about leaven and slavery and unleavened and freedom from bondage? What is it that we're supposed to be thinking about and learning on this day, today? What is it? And is it just physical slavery that's being talked about? Or is this really spiritual slavery that we need to get freedom from? Let's start in Exodus 20. You can probably quote this. Exodus 20. And I would like to read verse 2. I am Jehovah your God, Exodus 20, verse 2, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. That is said right before the Ten Commandments are given. Who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. How often do you think of yourself as having been a slave at some point in the past? Or do you think of yourself as being a slave right now? 5 times in Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy 5, verse 15. Deuteronomy 5, verse 15. In the middle of Moses reiterating the Ten Commandments, Deuteronomy 5, verse 15, right after the Sabbath day has been given, and remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and Jehovah your God brought you out from there by a mighty hand and by an outstretched arm. Therefore Jehovah your God commanded you to keep the Sabbath day. Do you remember that you were a slave and Jehovah your God rescued you personally, every Sabbath day? It's right in the middle of the Sabbath day commandment here. I read where he reminded us right before he gave the Ten Commandments in Exodus 20. 15:15, Deuteronomy 15:15. So this is talking about if you have a slave or if you have a bondservant, how you should treat them. Verse 15, you shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and Jehovah your God redeemed you. Therefore, I command you this thing today. Make sure that if you have a bondservant or a slave, that you treat them right. And remember that you are in the same situation yourself. Chapter 16, verse 12. The 3 feasts are being reiterated. Feast of the Passover, and then the Feast of Weeks. And in my Bible, this is at the end of the section on the Feast of Weeks. And you shall remember, chapter 16, verse 12, that you were a slave in Egypt, and you shall be careful to observe these statutes. So when you keep the 3 feasts every year, do you remember that you were a slave? And because you were a slave who God has redeemed, are you careful to observe them? Now, whether this is tied to the Feast of Weeks or whether this is tied to the Feast of Tabernacles, which is right after it, or whether it's kind of bound to all three, fine, we can discuss exactly how tightly this is bound, but it's right after the Feast of Weeks. Yeah, chapter 24, verse 18. Verse 17, you shall not pervert justice, due the stranger or the fatherless, nor take a widow's garment as a pledge. Verse 18, and you shall remember that you were a slave in Egypt, and Jehovah your God redeemed you. From there, therefore I command you to do this thing. When you reap your harvest in your field, and forget a sheaf in the field, you shall not go back to get it. It shall be for the stranger and the fatherless and the widow, that Jehovah your God may bless you. So when we see somebody in need, do we remember that we were slaves? And go help them appropriately. If we're harvesting something and you forget to bring some in, do we just leave it there so that somebody who needs it can go get it? That's a way to be generous to the poor. Well, chapter 24, verse 18. That's where we are. And then verse 24. Hang on. Yeah. So here we've seen that we're commanded to remember that we were slaves and that we were redeemed. Right? We saw this was brought up right before the Ten Commandments. It was brought up in the middle of the Ten Commandments on the Sabbath day. It was brought up around how we treat a bondservant and that we remember to release them after 6 years of service. It was brought up in the area of being generous to the poor and releasing debts that they have for us. It was brought up in the middle of the three feasts, right after the Feast of Pentecost or the Feast of Weeks. It has a section where it's making sure we don't pervert justice and that we leave some for the stranger and the fatherless so that people who need to be taken care of are being taken care of. So, how often, when was the last time you thought of yourself as being someone who has been redeemed from slavery? Because these verses should be personal to us. This shouldn't just be, well, yeah, long time ago, many thousands of years ago, today, but a few thousand years ago, God rescued, he redeemed the Israelites from the Egyptians. This should be personal. And as we go through, I'm going to show that it actually is quite clear that there's a spiritual journey and there's a physical journey. And the physical journey doesn't actually lead to spiritual freedom, but the spiritual journey actually leads to spiritual freedom. And there's a parallelism that we should see. So we should be thinking of this as from a spiritual perspective. Were we spiritual slaves? Are we still spiritually slaves? Have we been redeemed? Now, Exodus 13:3. Because those ones were remembering that we've been slaves, primarily, and that we've been redeemed. Exodus 13:3. And Moses said to the people, remember that this day, today, this day, in which you went out of Egypt, out of the house of bondage, for by the strength of hand, Jehovah brought you out of this place. No leavened bread shall be eaten. So when you eat no leavened bread, or you eat unleavened bread, do you think of slavery? Do you think of being redeemed from slavery, or do you think of being rescued from slavery? Because what I'm seeing when I look at this is we were all in spiritual bondage to sin, to the devil. And then we have been redeemed. But even though we were redeemed, we still had to be rescued and dragged out with a strong hand. And then we still have to fight the urge to turn back and go back to bondage and back to sin. We have to press on forward. Exodus 34:18. Exodus 34, verse 18. The feast of unleavened bread you shall keep 7 days. You shall eat unleavened bread as I commanded you in the month of Abib. For in the month of Abib you came out of Egypt. So do you remember that you came out of Egypt? You came out of bondage. Is this personal? Is this personal that you come out of bondage? Oh. Deuteronomy 16:3. Deuteronomy 16, verse 3. Again, the instructions on unleavened bread. You shall eat no leavened bread with it. 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread. That is the bread of affliction. What is the bread of affliction? Well, it's obviously unleavened bread, but I'll show you another name for the bread of affliction in just a little bit. For you came out of the land of Egypt in haste, that you may remember the day in which you came out of the land of Egypt, all the days of your life. Do you remember coming out of Egypt all the days of your life? Is this something we actually think about? I've just read 3 different verses that said, remember this day, specifically talking about the first day of unleavened bread. What is so special about remembering that we came out of Egypt, that we have to do it? And what is so special about remembering that we were slaves? I read you 5 times in Deuteronomy. I read you one more time in Exodus, where God, he didn't say remember that first time. He just reminded us that he had brought us out. That's quite a bit that we're told. We're either reminded or we're told to remember that we were slaves and we have been redeemed and rescued, and he pulled us out with a strong hand. So you often think of 1 Corinthians. So let's go look at 1 Corinthians now, because in 1 Corinthians, it'll take us just a little bit of time to get there, because while we're in 1 Corinthians, I want to read a few other verses that are right there. So 1 Corinthians, I'm going to get to, in 5 we'll see it, but verse 2, 5 verse 2. And you are puffed up and have not rather mourned, that he who had done this deed might be taken away from you. So puffed up, you might think that's a little bit related to leaven, puffed up. Now, if you go look at the Strong's definition for puffed up, you'll see things like arrogance and pride. But this word was not at that time actually used metaphorically to mean arrogance and pride. It was meant to use a little bit of something else. So let's go back a few verses. So what had happened right before this? Verse 17. For this reason I have sent Timothy to you, who is my beloved and faithful son in the Lord, who will remind you of my ways in Christ, as I teach everywhere in every church. 1 Corinthians is not the first time Paul is correcting the Corinthians church for this particular sin. Paul had already sent Timothy to take care of this. Now some, verse 18, are puffed up as though I were not coming to you. So they're not treating Timothy as if he has the same authority to tell them to behave that Paul had. Puffed up. They're getting angry because they're being told what to do. What's the word I'm looking for? Indignant. They're getting indignant. Now, if you look up in the Liddell and Scott Greek English lexicon, it does not list arrogance or pride as a metaphorical meaning for this. It lists indignant as the metaphorical meaning of puffed up. So if you're talking about a person being puffed up, the person is indignant. And kind of think of a pot that's like boiling, right? The person's getting all huffy and puffy and upset when they're corrected. That is what this puffed up is about. This puffed up is getting indignant when you get corrected. Rightly so. Chapter 5, verse 1, there's some sexual immorality that's reported. Verse 2, you are puffed up. Well, when I sent Timothy to tell you, you got indignant instead of dealing with it. Instead of dealing with it, you got indignant. Verse 6, your glorying is not good. Do you not know that a little leaven leavens the whole lump? A little bit of being indignant spreads and doesn't actually help anything get better. It helps everything get worse. If you look at businesses and then you look at the different levels of leadership, if you look at the most senior people in businesses who are actually successful, they take feedback and they learn and they grow from it. And if you do not take feedback in the business world, you can be promoted to your level of incompetence, but you won't grow beyond your level of incompetence. You can be promoted so far that you're not able to actually be competent anymore. But if you can take the feedback without becoming indignant and actually learn and grow, do you think God wants us to be a bunch of grunts that aren't actually very effective? Or do you think God wants us to say, okay, well, you're not effective right there. Change that one thing and you'll become more effective. Don't tolerate sexual immorality in the church in the church group, among your ecclesia. That's the context right here. Don't become indignant when I correct you on that one thing. That tolerating that is holding you back. Glorying about it is holding you back. Potentially, you're actually on the wrong way. I didn't read it, but chapter 4, verse 21. I found this one particularly interesting. What do you want? Shall I come to you with a rod, or in love and a spirit of gentleness? Paul was conflicted about how to correct the Corinthians. He was conflicted. This was something that was hard for him. This did not come easy. He didn't want to wield the big stick on the Corinthians. But he had the strength of character to know he can't let stand what was happening. It has to be dealt with. 4 verse 6, your glorying is not good. A little leaven leavens the whole lump. Verse 7, therefore purge out the old leaven, that you may be a new lump, since you truly are unleavened. For indeed Christ, our Passover, was sacrificed for us. Now here you're starting to see a little bit of the spiritual side of the journey, right? Christ, our Passover, was sacrificed for us. That redeems us. That's to redeem us out of slavery. Verse 8, therefore let us keep the feast, not with the old leaven, nor with the leaven of malice and wickedness, but with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. So here you saw the leaven could have referred to the sexual immorality that's being tolerated. It can also refer to the being indignant when you're corrected for the whole congregation. And that's also referred to as malice and wickedness. And then the unleavened bread is referred to as representative of sincerity and truth. So, do you remember we read about the bread of affliction, the unleavened bread of affliction? The unleavened bread of affliction is here called the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. Now, I have a book of truth here. There might be some imperfections where it hasn't been translated correctly or there have been some transmission errors. But here we have a book of truth. So let's go look at something about this book of truth. I want us to look in Ezekiel 3. And I want you to just think what happens when, what are we supposed to be doing with this book? Ezekiel 3, verse 3. And he said to me, Son of man, feed your belly and fill your stomach with this scroll that I give to you. So I ate, and it was in my mouth like honey in sweetness. Ezekiel 3:3. So if we metaphorically eat the scroll, eat this book, sometimes it's like honey. And then if we go to verse 10, moreover, he said to me, Son of man, receive into your heart all my words. So eating truth and sincerity should certainly include receiving my words, receiving God's words that I speak to you and hear with your ears. So do we receive God's words in Ezekiel 3:10 into our hearts? Now, you'll see kind of a counterexample in Revelation 10. In Revelation 10, John is given a book, and he's told to eat the book. And the book is sweet like honey when he eats it, but it's bitter in his stomach. It's just, you've had that feeling, right? You eat something, you're like, I shouldn't have eaten that. It just doesn't feel good. Well, when you eat the words of God, when you put the words of God inside you and they become part of your heart, they're written on your heart, they become part of you, sometimes there's some affliction and some bitterness that will result. In fact, there is always going to be some bitterness and some affliction. There's a family we know that they only learned this last year about keeping God's laws. And they'd raised themselves a pig before they learnt about God's laws. They'd raised themselves a pig. Now, this wasn't, they'd raised it, they'd slaughtered this pig, they had this pig in this freezer. And this wasn't the cheap pork that you can buy at the supermarket. This was the good quality pork that is like raised on a farm, where you do everything right. You've done everything right. I looked up a pig. I don't know exactly how big their pig is, but an average pig would be like 250 pounds, and you might get 150 pounds of meat off of that, roughly, once it's cut. So meat with bones, like what you would, once it's butchered, weight. That's probably over $1,000 of pork when you have a pig in your freezer. And they learned that eating pork is not right. So they got rid of a freezer full of pork. Now, you can say that's not the worst affliction in the world. It's not the worst affliction in the world. But it is an affliction. I mean, that was meat for their family for the rest of the year, or for the next year, right? I mean, 100 pounds, 150 pounds of meat, that lasts a family of a little while, right? If we take the words of truth and we put these words and we write these words on our heart, sometimes, but all of us will experience this, there will be affliction. Sincerity and truth will result in affliction, not every time, and also only for a season, but there will be a season of affliction that will result. The bread of affliction is the same bread. That's the bread of sincerity and truth. Hebrews 11. All too often, well, not all too often, sometimes we focus on those who showed great faith and that they're heroes. the jaws of lions were stopped. But sometimes it's not quite like that. Verse 35. Women received their dead raised to life again. Well, that's quite a miracle. Others were tortured, not accepting deliverance, that they might obtain a better resurrection. They followed the sincerity and truth, and that resulted in torture. Verse 36, still others had trials of mockings and scourgings, yes, and of chains and imprisonment. Verse 37, they were stoned, they were sawn in two, were tempted, were slain with the sword. They wandered about in sheepskin and goatskins, being destitute, afflicted, tormented, of whom the world was not worthy. They were afflicted. They ate the bread of affliction, that they might obtain a better resurrection. Verse 25, so talking about Moses, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin. Moses chose to eat the bread of affliction. So, Job says this quite nicely. So let's turn to Job, and let's read how he puts it. In Job 36. Job 36, verse 21, Job explains this quite nicely. Verse 21, take heed, do not turn to iniquity, for you have chosen this rather than affliction. So Elihu was saying, your choices are iniquity or affliction. Don't choose iniquity. That leaves choosing affliction. That leaves choosing the bread of sincerity and truth. Those are your options. Take heed, do not turn to iniquity, for you have chosen this, that would be iniquity, rather than affliction. Not every time we follow God's law is it going to result in affliction. There are huge numbers of blessings. At the Feast of Tabernacles this last year, I think Mark went through a message where he talked about all the blessings that the Israelites received while they were going through the wilderness and how they were protected. And I mean, there must have been water every day for the animals. I mean, if you have 2 million people and 10 million sheep, you need water every day. You can't just carry that amount of water with you, right? So there was a huge amount of protection that happened, but there were also afflictions and challenges and things that were hard. Now, I started off talking about slaves. And in Hebrew, the word abed, A-B-E-D, abed, is the one that's translated as slaves. It shows up over 800 times in the Old Testament. And the most common way it's translated is servants. It's translated over 700 times as servants, and about 70 times as slaves or bondservant or something along those lines. And then there's a sprinkling of other things like attendant or male or something else. There's a female version of it that shows up about 70 times, and it's also most commonly translated as maid or as maidservant, and then it's also translated a few times as slave or as slave girl. And in Hebrew, you can have the same letters, which can result in a few different words because they don't have the vowels that they write. They have vowels in the spoken, but not in the written. So what you write can be a few different words. And these tend to be a word family, where they're all related. So if you go look at the ones that are related, you'll find other meanings like to work, do, to serve, to make, a work, and workers. This is the same word family as slave or servant in Hebrew. So let's go look in Genesis. I want to look in Genesis just a little bit so you can kind of see some examples of how this word is used. In Genesis 18, verse 3, and this would be the word that would have been used when it says, remember you were a slave. Genesis 18, verse 3. Exodus 18 does not work. Oh, it's a good verse, but not the one I need right now. Genesis 18, verse 3. This is Abraham speaking. My Lord, if I have now found favor in your sight, do not pass by your servant. The translators chose to say servant and not slave when Abraham said this. And if you look in Genesis 24, verse 2, I just want to show these. I'm just going to show 3 examples in Genesis here. Genesis 24, verse 2. So Abraham said to the oldest servant of his house, who ruled over all that he had, please put your hand under my thigh and swear that you'll do a good job finding a wife for my son. Servant. This is the word. And if you go look in Genesis 26, 24, now this is God speaking. And Jehovah appeared to him the same night and said, I am the God of your father Abraham. Do not fear, for I am with you. I will bless you and multiply your descendants for my servant Abraham's sake. So Abraham identified himself as a servant of God. Jehovah identified Abraham as a servant or a slave of Jehovah. And Abraham himself had servants or slaves. And interesting note, at some point in Abraham's life, before he had sons, he had his top servant would be the one that he would have adopted as a son and would have inherited all that he had, would have been his son. So you can say that there was a path here from servant or slave where you could be adopted, and then if you're adopted, you would have been in charge. I mean, you would have gotten the whole estate. Everything that Abraham owned would have gone to his servant. It would have been his firstborn son in inheritance. He had sons, and God told him that's not the way it's going to be, so he didn't do it that way. Now you can see the same type of thing in Daniel. In Daniel 1, verse 12. Please test your servants for 10 days. So Babylon under Nebuchadnezzar had gone and raided the Israelites and brought back servants. They didn't bring back slaves. They brought back servants. They might have brought back slaves, actually. There might have actually been a slave, but it's the same word. It's a worker. It's a person that does work. Please test your servant for 10 days and let them give us vegetables to drink. Now, here you see Daniel was a servant to Nebuchadnezzar, or a slave to Nebuchadnezzar and Babylon. In chapter 6, verse 20, Daniel 6, verse 20, and he came to the den and cried out with a lamenting voice to Daniel. The king spoke, saying to Daniel, Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to deliver you from the lions? So yeah, it's recognized that Daniel is a servant of God. So Daniel is a servant of Nebuchadnezzar. Daniel is a servant of God. And in Daniel 9:6, we'll see that your servants, the prophets. So the prophets are all referred to as God's servants or God's slaves. And you can see that there was kind of the same type of scenario with Joseph. Joseph was a servant to the Pharaoh, or a slave to the Pharaoh. Joseph was also a servant of God, and his obedience to God was above, obviously, his obedience to Pharaoh or to Potiphar. And you can see that Joseph's brothers, when they come to buy grain from him, they refer to themselves as his servants or as his slaves or as his workers. It's translator's choice exactly how they choose to translate it. Now, here I want to show you where the same letters, but one of the related words, how it gets translated. Ezra 7, Yeah. Ezra 7, verse 26. I was forgetting where Ezra was for a moment. Whoever will not observe the law of your God. In Ezra 7, verse 26, this word observe is the same, it's the same Hebrew spelling. It's one of the slightly related words to slave or to worker. Whoever will not observe the law of your God and the law of the king, let judgment be executed speedily on him. Observe. So that kind of shows how, some breadth on how the words can be used, that there's a bit of breadth there on how you can be a slave. Now, I read these as servant because that's the way it's translated here, but if we go look in the New Testament and see how in the New Testament, like Titus 1:1 would be an example. I don't even need to turn there. It says Paul, and in some translations it says Paul, a servant of God, and in others it says Paul, a bondservant of God and an apostle of Jesus Christ. That word translated as servant is doulos, D-O-U-L-O-S, doulos. And in Greek, doulos is really always a slave. And specifically, that's a slave from birth. It's always a slave. There are other words that can be that would be used if it was a servant. So there would be diakonos, from which we get deacon. That's a worker. That could be used as a worker. And if you go look at Matthew, where it talks about laborers, well, that's yet another Greek word that would be used for laborers or for a servant or for somebody who's hired. That's not doulos. Doulos really means slave. So now there is another word for a slave who is captured and made a slave. That word doesn't appear in the New Testament at all, but the verb that would be related to it, I think shows up in 1 Timothy 1:10 or thereabouts, where it's translated as kidnappers or man-stealers. Men-stealers or that type of thing. So a kidnapper, so the other type of slave is somebody that's made a slave. That would be somebody who's kidnapped. And that word in that form, as the noun of it, doesn't show up in the New Testament at all. And the verb shows up once, as in, don't be a kidnapper. Bad things are going to happen to you when God deals with you if you're a kidnapper. Now, I don't need to turn there either, but in Revelation 15:3, they sing the song of Moses, the servant, the doulos of God, the slave. In Revelation, really what they're saying is Moses was the slave of God. Now, let's go look at 1 Corinthians 6. Because when we look at this, there really is a progression that has to happen. We start off as a slave of sin. And you can't just be completely free. You have to switch to becoming a slave of righteousness. And then once we have learned how to deal with that, then Jesus Christ talks about how he will call us friends and not slaves anymore. And God talks about how we'll be sons, not slaves anymore. But there's a progression. It's not that it's a little bit like if you have kids, if you have little kids. You say, the rule is, you do not go out past the front gate onto the road without an appropriate adult's permission. That is the rule. Do not break it. Once your kid has matured to a certain point, then you give them the freedom to go onto the road because you know they will obey your rule for not running in front of a car. You know that they'll make the right decision about running in front of a car or not running in front of a car, right? So there's kind of a progression there that happens. 1 Corinthians 6, verses 19 and 20. Or do you not know that your body is the temple of the Holy Spirit who is in you, whom you have from God, and you are not your own? You are God's slave. We should be obeying God as a slave. For you were bought at a price. Therefore glorify God in your body and in your spirit, which are God's. Now, God, saying we're a slave to God, God is not the same as a physical master. So conjuring up some bad images of a slave master that's a person is not the right picture to put in mind for God. I have two books here. That's The Life in Ancient Rome, and I have The New Testament, A Historical Introduction to the Early Christian Writings. And in both of these, they have articles on what slavery was like in Rome, in the Greeks. And between 10 and 30% of the population were slaves. So in a place like Rome, 30% of the population would have been slaves, and in more outlying regions and in other places, 10% of the population would be slaves. Somewhere between 10 and 30% would have been slaves. Slaves could be all walks of life. Slaves who were in agriculture or in mining tended to not live very long. They tended to die pretty quickly. They were typically treated horribly. But you could also have doctors who were slaves. You could have lawyers who were slaves. You could have skilled craftsmen who were slaves. And one of the things that they did was they gave those people an opportunity to get freedom quite often. Not all of them, but it was something that they did. More likely with the skilled slaves, where if you had a skilled slave, they could either you let them keep a little bit of their money so they could save up and buy their freedom. They could buy themselves from you and they could gain their freedom. Or you could make an agreement that, hey, you don't try to run away, you behave yourself, you work for me for 20 years, and then I'll give you your freedom. And you could if you adopted a slave, that slave became a full child to you from the law. So you've all heard of Augustus Caesar? Augustus Caesar was adopted by Julius Caesar. Augustus Caesar was Julius Caesar's nephew. He wasn't his son, but he adopted him, and Augustus Caesar was the heir to the throne. Julius Caesar adopted him and made him the heir, and he is treated as if he is a full son. Is treated as if there's no difference. So this is how we have it now, I want to go look at Matthew 13, because we need to think about the value a little bit of this. I want us to think about this. Matthew 13, and you probably know these ones off by heart. I want to start in verse 52, though, because I think this is a super important principle, and if we don't get the principle, then we misunderstand what the parables mean. 13:52. Then he said to them, therefore, every scribe instructed concerning the kingdom of heaven. So this is talking about people who can actually understand what these parables are talking about. Now, it's like a householder who brings out of his treasure things new and old. Every parable in this list about the kingdom of heaven brings out things old, which is things that you would already know, or things that you would already know from the other parables, but it also brings out things new. If there's an explanation for a parable in this list of the parables about the kingdom of heaven, if it does not give you something new that none of the other parables give you, then that explanation is wrong. Everyone gives you something new that none of the other parables about the kingdom of heaven here give you. So now, let's go to verse 44. Again, the kingdom of heaven is like a treasure hidden in a field, which a man found and hid, and for joy over it he goes and sells all that he had and buys that field. So here, there's something about this treasure that's hidden that we're supposed to learn about the kingdom of heaven. So this treasure, think of this treasure as an immensely valuable treasure. You discovered that there's diamonds on this property. Not just diamonds, but diamonds. Like, you could go walk there with a cup and just pick them up. They're just loose on the ground. I mean, you're talking about like trillions and trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars, like immeasurably valuable treasure. No way can you buy that treasure. No way. You can't buy that treasure. But what you can do is you can save everything you have. You sell the shirt off your back and the shoes on your feet and the house that you sleep in and that half a loaf of bread that's in your pantry. You sell every single thing. And you can buy it to the last penny. You're able to buy the field. If that is how valuable we should think of the kingdom of heaven. It's so valuable that we would sell every single thing to get some access to it. But we can't actually buy the kingdom of heaven ourselves. And that's important because when we get to verse 45, this one all too often is explained to be exactly the same meaning. But if you read verse 45 and 46, you come up with exactly the same meaning as verse 44, that the kingdom of heaven is extremely valuable, then you missed it. Verse 45, again, the kingdom of heaven is like a merchant. So there's some characteristic of this merchant that we need to think about for the kingdom of heaven. It's like a merchant seeking beautiful pearls. So, what is the kingdom of heaven seeking? Sons and daughters? Those would be the beautiful pearls that the kingdom of heaven would be seeking. Who, when he had found one pearl of great price, went and sold all that he had and bought it. The kingdom of heaven, when Jesus Christ was sacrificed, that's selling all that he had and bought it. Now, you can say, well, shouldn't this pearl of great price represent the kingdom of heaven? Well, if it does, if the pearl of great price represents the kingdom of heaven, then if you just sold all that you had, you could go and buy it. The implication would be that you could buy your way in. And guess what? Saying you can buy your way in, or you can just keep the law good enough, you'll earn your spot in the kingdom of heaven. That is leaven that we need to get out. I haven't come to the verse where I show it as leaven yet. Hopefully I'll get there and not run out of time before I get there. But thinking we can be justified by works, by keeping the law, that we can earn a spot, if we just sell everything we have, we can buy ourselves a spot in the kingdom of heaven. That is a leaven that we need to get rid of. And that is actually called leaven. And while we're here, I want to read verse 33. Another parable he spoke to them. The kingdom of heaven is like leaven, which a woman took and hid in 3 measures of meal, till it was all leavened. It's possible those 3 measures of meal are referring to the 3 feasts that we have. But so we already looked at a lump, right? Become a new lump. Put out the old leaven and become a new lump. Well, do you not want to be leavened? Do you not want your new lump is going to become leavened, right? That's what a lump does. It becomes leavened when you have it, right? But do you not want it leavened with this leaven that the kingdom of heaven is like? That will kind of grow towards the kingdom of heaven? That's some leaven that you could have in there. Now, I talked about it as putting in truth and sincerity. So truth and sincerity is something that helps you grow there. And I had no perfect ordering of all the scriptures here because so many of them, like if you understand the one, it helps you understand the other, but you have to understand the other to understand the first. They kind of tie together in how you want to understand all of them to actually get the continuity of scripture. So I know I am forward referencing here a little bit when I talk about this. Now, I want to show that some of this physical bondage is really representative of a spiritual bondage. And I want to start to explore that. So John 6, we're going to get to John 8, but we're going to start in John 6. John 6. And I want to start in verse 32. John 6:32. Then Jesus said to them, most assuredly, I say to you, Moses did not give the bread from heaven, but my Father gives you the true bread from heaven. For the bread of God is he who comes down from heaven and gives life into the world. So Jesus Christ is the true bread of life. And if Jesus Christ is unleavened, then the true bread of life is unleavened bread. And Jesus said to him, I am the bread of life, but he who comes to me shall never hunger, and he who believes in me shall never thirst. But I said to you that you have seen me, and yet you do not believe. Verse 38, for I have come down from heaven not to do my own will, but the will of him who sent me. Verse 48, I am the bread of life. Your fathers ate the manna in the wilderness and are dead. This is the bread which comes down from heaven, that one may eat of it and not die. Verse 51, I am the living bread which came down from heaven. If anyone eats of this bread, he will live forever. And the bread that I shall give is my flesh, which I shall give for the life of the world. So, yea, there's reference to his death. That's that bread. Verse 54, whoever eats my flesh and drinks my blood has eternal life, and I will raise him up in the last day. Verse 63, it is the Spirit who gives life. The flesh profits nothing. The words that I speak to you are spirit. They are life. So the bread of life is Jesus Christ, and the bread Jesus Christ gives life. And here we see an example of how he gives life. The words that he speaks are life. The words that he speaks are truth. They're also sincere. But do we take those words in sincerity and in truth? Verse 64. But there are some of you who do not believe, for Jesus knew that some of them didn't believe. Chapter 7, verse 26. But look, he speaks boldly, and they say nothing. Do the rulers know indeed that this is truly the Christ? So some of the people knew that he was the Christ. Some of the people knew that. Now, let's get to chapter 8, verse 30. And as he spoke these words, many believed. In verse 31. Then Jesus said to the Jews who believed him, if you abide in my word and are my disciples indeed. So Jesus is not speaking to the Pharisees here. Jesus is speaking to those who believed him, who believed that he was the Christ. Are you one of those who believes Jesus is the Christ? This is how people who believed Jesus was the Christ responded. This is not how the Pharisees responded, right? Verse 32, and you shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free. And they answered, we're Abraham's descendants. Verse 34, most assuredly, I say to you, whoever commits sin is a slave to sin. And a slave does not abide in the house forever, but a son abides forever. Therefore, if the Son makes you free, you shall be free indeed. Verse 37, I know that you are Abraham's descendants, but you seek to kill me. Did you catch that? People who believed he was the Christ, when he said, you are slaves to sin, got indignant. They got puffed up, and they sought to kill him. That word puffed up was used by, who was it? Sophocles. It was used by Sophocles as speaking blood and murder. This speaking. But it was in the getting huffed up, speaking blood and murder. Here, he just tells them that you're slaves of sin, and they want to kill him. The indignant. They get all indignant. Verse 42, and Jesus said, if God were your father, you would love me, for I proceed forth and came from God. Nor have I come of myself, but he sent me. Why do you not understand my speech? because you are not able to listen to my word. You are of your father, the devil. So, people who believed he was the Christ, he told them they're slaves of sin. I didn't read it so much in 41, but they said, you're born of fornication. They got all upset with him. They said, we're Abraham's descendants. And now they're showing that they're actually sons of the devil. They're slaves of the devil too. They're slaves of sin. And the point is for us to be taking this as a warning, right? Are we doing Satan's work, or are we doing God's work? And we can be doing God's work and we can slip up, like Peter slipped, where Christ corrected him and said, get behind me, Satan, where we just for a moment go and do some of Satan's work. We returned to bondage. We can do that. And we might have to keep fighting the urge to not return. But because I tell the truth, you do not believe me, verse 45. Verse 46, which of you convicts me of a sin? And if I tell the truth, why do you not believe me? Now, John 15:15, I want to go there because in passing, what we're here. No longer do I call you servants. No longer do I call you slaves. This is doulos. No longer do I call you slaves, for a slave does not know what his master is doing. But I have called you friends, for all things that I have heard from my Father I have made known to you. And if you read verse 14, you are my friends if you do whatever I command you. So Jesus calling us friends does not exempt us from doing what he tells us to do. We still have to do what he tells us to. But he no longer calls us slaves. He calls us friends. Galatians 4. Let's go look there because this, I think, ties in. In this section, once we read this passage, this actually makes it very clear that there's a spiritual parallel to the physical parallel. Verse 4:7. Therefore you are no longer a slave, but a son, and if a son, then an heir of God through Christ. Verse 21. Tell me, you who desire to be under the law, do you not hear the law? For it is written that Abraham had two sons, the one by a bondwoman and the other by a free woman. But he who was of the bondwoman was born of the flesh, and he of the free woman through promise, which things are symbolic. For these are the two covenants, the one from Mount Sinai, which gives birth of bondage, which is Hagar. Are you aware of the Hagar covenant? The covenant at Mount Sinai, the covenant that does not lead to freedom. It does not lead to spiritual freedom. Being taken out of physical bondage in Egypt, being led through the desert, having a covenant at Mount Sinai, reaching physical Jerusalem, does not lead to spiritual freedom. For this Hagar is Mount Sinai and Arabia, and corresponds to Jerusalem, which now is and is the bondage of her, and is in bondage with her children. It doesn't lead to true freedom, it still leads to bondage. But the Jerusalem above is free, which is the mother of us all. Verse 28, now we, brethren, as Isaac, are children of promise. So Isaac was the children of promise, but he who was born according to the flesh then persecuted him who was born of the Spirit. Nevertheless, what does the scripture say? Cast out the bondwoman, and the bondwoman shall not be heir with the free woman. So then, brethren, we are not children of the bondwoman, but of the free. There are two covenants, and even if these covenants hadn't been ratified yet, Abraham was on the spiritual covenant, the one that goes to the Jerusalem above, which is free. Jesus Christ hadn't died yet, but Abraham was on the covenant of promise, the one that leads to Jerusalem above, which is free. He wasn't saved by his works. He was saved by the death of Jesus. Well, he got forgiveness because of the death of Jesus Christ. The same as all the rest of us, even though God hadn't done that part of the deal yet. It was promised. It was a covenant of promise for him. Chapter 5, verse 1. Stand fast, therefore, in the liberty by which Christ has made us free, and do not be entangled again with the yoke of bondage. Indeed, I, Paul, say to you, if you're uncircumcised, it profits you nothing. Verse 4. You have become estranged from Christ, you who attempt to be justified by law, for you have fallen from grace. Verse 7, you ran well. Who hindered you from obeying the truth? This persuasion does not come from him who calls you. A little leaven leavens the whole lump. I have confidence in you. What is this leaven? This leaven is thinking you can be justified by the law. And the example of being justified by the law is that you were circumcised on the 8th day. Whether you are circumcised or not does not score you points to get into the kingdom of heaven. It does not score you points to get into the Jerusalem above, which is free. It neither buys you a full entry pass nor scores you points towards buying a full entry pass. You are not justified by law. Thinking, if I just do enough right things, God will have to give me a spot, is not how it works. And that is leaven. That is the little leaven that leavens the whole lump right here. There's clearly a link between, now there's liberty. So let's go look at James 1. I want to look at James 1, verse 25. But he who looks into the perfect law of liberty and continues in it, and is not a forgetful hearer, but a doer of the work, this one will be blessed in what he does. So this isn't saying that we don't keep the law. We do keep the law. We do our best to keep the law. But we are not justified by keeping the law. We are redeemed by the sacrifice of Jesus Christ. We are rescued by the strong arm of Jehovah. Chapter 2, verses 12 and 13. So speak and do as those who will be judged by the law of liberty. For judgment is without mercy to the one who has shown no mercy. Mercy triumphs over judgment. I didn't remember that. Do you remember? Mercy triumphs over judgment. And thank God it does, because none of us would have a chance if mercy did not triumph over judgment. And mercy triumphs over judgment to the one who has shown mercy. You might want to show some mercy, if you can, so that God can show you some mercy. It might be kind of an important thing. So there's one other leaven that we often see, and that's in Matthew 16. I'm sure you all know what this leaven is. I'm sure you're all familiar with it. Matthew 16, verse 6. And Jesus said to them, take heed and beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. In verse 12, and then they understood that he did not tell them to beware of the leaven of bread, but of the doctrine of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. What is the doctrine of the Pharisees and the Sadducees? Well, it certainly has an overlap with that leaven we just talked about. They taught that you could be justified by keeping the law. You just keep it right, you'll earn your ticket into the kingdom of heaven. That was one thing they taught. Now, that's not the complete total of the leaven, because what they also did was they took something that was loosely based on the Bible. And then they made up a whole bunch of rules that really had nothing to do with the Bible, just a bunch of nonsense. And these traditions they put as higher than actually obeying God. You can go look at the example, right? If you give some money to the temple, then you don't have to look after your parents anymore, right? Just pay your way out of your obligations. And that's kind of what they did in their teachings. They made up all these rules, and they said, if you just follow our rules, exactly. So the Pharisees had a rule that you could only walk a certain distance from your property on the Sabbath day, right? What they built was a loophole into it. All you do is you put some sand in your pocket, and right before you've reached your maximum distance, just drop a few grains. That's your property. So you can walk the same distance again. And then you just drop a few more grains. So is that gonna... So by sprinkling a little bit of sand every mile or whatever the distance is that you're allowed to go, would that earn you salvation, really? But that's what the Pharisees were teaching. They were making up these rules that really had... Now, I mean, the Bible does teach the Sabbath. So that is loosely based on the Bible, as in not at all, by the fact that it's some rule about a Sabbath, and the Bible teaches that there's a Sabbath that needs to be observed. That would be the doctrines of the Pharisees. It's all these little things you add on and make up, and that really enslave you. They enslave you. They don't actually set you free. So leaven is malice and deceit. It's man's teachings. It's thinking we can earn our way in. Let's go look at Exodus 12. And I want to look at this really thinking about this as the spiritual journey from bondage to salvation. Exodus 12. Let's start in verse 15. 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread. On the first day you shall remove leaven from your house. You shall cease having leaven in your house. For whoever eats unleavened bread from the first day until the seventh day, that person shall be cut off. On the first day there shall be a holy convocation. On the seventh day there shall be a holy convocation. No manner of work shall be done on them. But that which everyone must eat, that only may ye prepare. So you shall observe the feast of unleavened bread. For on this same day I will have brought your armies out of the land of Egypt. On this same day I rescued you from bondage to sin. Therefore you shall observe this day throughout your generations as an everlasting ordinance. In the first month, on the 14th day of the month at evening, you shall eat unleavened bread until the 21st day of the month at evening. For 7 days no leaven shall be found in your houses. So are we putting out the leaven of malice and deceit? Are we putting out the leaven of thinking we can earn our salvation by, we can be justified by keeping the law a little bit more perfectly than someone else? Verse 20, you shall eat nothing leavened in all your dwellings. You shall eat unleavened bread. Are we putting in the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth? Are we putting in the unleavened bread of life, of the body of Jesus Christ? Are we putting in the unleavened bread of the words of Jesus Christ? Are we putting in the unleavened bread of the words of Jehovah? Then Moses called for all the elders of Israel and said, pick your lambs. Chapter 13. Let's go to verse 3. Exodus 13, verse 3. And Moses said to the people, remember this day in which you went out of Egypt, out of the house of bondage, for by strength of hand Jehovah brought you out of this place. No leavened bread shall be eaten. Remember that Jehovah with a mighty arm rescued you, personally you, me, personally me, from the bondage of sin. He redeemed us, and he dragged us out, just like Lot had to be dragged out to avoid being destroyed. God dragged us out with strong hand, with a strong arm, out of the bondage of sin. On this day you are going out in the month of Abib. Verse 5, and it shall be when Jehovah brings you into the land of the Canaanites and the Hittites and the Amorites and the Hivites and the Jebusites, which he swore to your fathers to give you, a land flowing with milk and honey, you shall keep the service in this month. 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread, and on the seventh there shall be a feast to Jehovah. Unleavened bread shall be eaten 7 days, and no leavened bread shall be seen among you. Verse 9, it shall be a sign to you on your hand and as a memorial between your eyes, that Jehovah's law may be in your mouth. How do you get Jehovah's law in your mouth? Out of the heart, the mouth speaks. What is it that we have to be putting in? Like, the result of following these rules should be that Jehovah's word is on our mouths, is in our mouths. That means we had to be putting Jehovah's words on our heart. We had to be eating the book, as in putting the book inside us, putting it onto our heart, making it part of us. You want to put unleavened in? Well, the result is that his word is on your mouth. So you have to be actually reading it. You have to know what his word is to put it on your mouth. For with a strong hand, Jehovah has brought you out of Egypt, out of the bondage of slavery, out of the bondage of sin, out of the bondage of malice and deceit, out of bondage. You shall therefore keep this ordinance. So leaving slavery is hard. And if you look, just look how quickly things degenerated. Chapter 14, verse 12. Let us alone, that we may serve the Egyptians, for it would have been better for us to stay in bondage. This was, they'd barely ever left, right? 16, verse 3. It would have been better if we'd died. We should have stayed in the land of Egypt with our meat pots. I like meat pots. But a meat pot is not worth staying in the house of bondage. It's not worth staying as in bondage to sin. It's not worth staying in bondage to malice and deceit. 17, verse 3. And the people thirsted for water and complained against Moses and saying, is this why you brought us out of Egypt? You should have just left us there. You shouldn't have brought us out. Like, you, me, personally, God has rescued us from bondage to sin. And we now have to obey him as a slave would obey a master. And we're to become friends. And Jesus talks about us as friends. And we're to become sons of God, where we know what's going on, whereas slaves don't know what's going on, what the plan is, right? How often do we get tempted to go back to the bondage of sin? Do we think about that? Because the example is, I've only gotten to chapter 17. I haven't even gotten to the end of Exodus, right? I've already read 3 cases where they wanted to go back. And I like meat pots. Who doesn't, right? Unless you can't eat meat, then you wouldn't like meat pots. So why were we rescued? Why were the Egyptians rescued from Egypt? Why were we rescued from the bondage of sin? Well, the stated case, the reason Jehovah, through Moses, gave to Pharaoh 6 times, let my people go so that they may worship me. The reason we have gotten freedom from the bondage of sin is so that we may worship Jehovah. And the 7th time it talks about so that they may sacrifice to me, so that we may do God's work. That is why there's freedom that's made available from sin, from wickedness, from malice. And we need to worship the Father in spirit and in truth, which is similar to the sincerity and the truth that we need to be putting on. Now, we already saw in Hebrews where they were not accepting of deliverance so that they might obtain a better resurrection. So that there is going to be affliction. We are going to eat the bread of affliction. And when we eat the bread of sincerity, and we might not realize we're eating the bread of affliction, though sometimes we will. Sometimes you're like, I have to do this, and I'm going to get smacked. I know it. There's no way around, but that's the only right thing to do. And you know you're going to get punished for it. You still have to do it. But most of the time, you just have to do the right thing. You just have to do the right thing. And most of the time, you hopefully won't be punished for doing the right thing. But sometimes you will. Sometimes you will be afflicted for doing the right thing. Sometimes you will be afflicted for following Jehovah, for obeying him, and for listening to Jesus Christ, and for obeying him. I'm just going to copy the line because I like it so much. Do you believe Jesus Christ? Well, then do what he says. I'm not the author of that one. I stole that from Terry, but it's such a good line. I just like it. Now, Deuteronomy 23, verse 15. This is the verse that I started this entire study from. For my personal. Deuteronomy 23, verse 15. You shall not give back to his master the slave who has escaped from his master to you. Did you know that? You're not to return an escaped slave to his master. If he escaped and came to you, you don't return him. But if you think about this as the spiritual journey, from being a slave to sin, to a slave to righteousness, to a friend of Jesus, to a son of Jehovah, how bad would it be to take somebody on that path and to return them back to being a slave of sin? How horrible of a thing would that be? Now, you're familiar with Matthew 17, where it talks about, do not cause a little one to stumble. Well, causing a little one to stumble, in many ways, is returning that little one who has escaped from being a slave of sin. By causing them to stumble, you're pointing them back to sin. You might not be doing it intentionally, but would that not be returning an escaped slave to their master, to their previous master? But you know what? We have been redeemed. And once we were redeemed, our slave master, the devil, sin, did not let us go willingly, even though we had been bought and paid for. So God had to come rescue us with a strong arm. Even though we'd been bought and paid for, he still had to come with a strong arm. And many times we weren't even willing. So he had to grab us by the scruff of the neck and just drag us away from bondage. And then we still keep getting tempted to look back at bondage and saying, but those meat pots were so nice. Yeah, those meat pots were nice. Not really. Not if you think of it in the whole context. Not if you think of it in context of all your male children getting killed. Not if you think of it in context of all the other things that came with those meat pots. And when you go on this one, you will eat the bread of affliction. You will eat the bread of affliction. That's going to happen. So are we getting the malice and the deceit out? Are we putting God's word in our hearts as unleavened bread? Are we taking Jesus Christ as unleavened bread, as unleavened, his sacrifice, the bread of life, his words that give liberty, the bread of life? Are we putting that bread into us? Are we putting those words into our hearts? And I'm not asking you to focus on anyone else. I mean, This is you focus on you and I focus on me. And occasionally, someone will have to point something out. And in that case, don't be indignant. Don't be puffed up. Don't be leavened. In that case, be unleavened. And then after we have become unleavened, we've become unleavened from sin. We've become unleavened from malice and deceit. We've become unleavened from the doctrine of the Pharisees. We then need to create a new lump. And this new lump is not to pick up the leaven of the Pharisees again. This new lump is to pick up the leaven that grows across the whole earth, like the kingdom of God. That's what you want your new lump to be picking up. And then those that come into contact with your new lump can also potentially become infected with the kingdom of heaven. Though I don't like the word infected in that scenario, but I don't have a better word to use off the top of my head at the moment. So you can spread. The kingdom of heaven can spread through you once you have that little seed growing in you that will grow to cover the whole earth, like a little bit of leaven that was hidden in 3 measures of meal. So we need to be doing God's work, not the devil's work. We need to be doing righteousness, not sin. We need to be an obedient slave to God, a friend to Jesus Christ, and a son to Jehovah.